You are listening to the podcast Coffee and Resistance Literature, promoting cultural exchange through literature, by the CRENAC Research Project and supported by the American Embassy to celebrate 200 years of diplomatic relations between Brazil and the United States.
Welcome everyone. You're listening to the podcast Coffee and Resistance Literature, promoting cultural exchange through literature. I am Evelyn Maia, a master's student in the PPLSA, an acronym in Portuguese for the Graduate Program in Languages and Knowledge in the Amazon at the Federal University of Pará, UFPA. And I am here with my colleague Gustavo.
Hello, my name is Gustavo Reis. I'm a doctoral student in literary studies in the graduate program in letters, PPGL, at Federal University of Pará. I have been working with resistance literature since I was undergraduate student, and now I'm working on my doctorate.
Nice. And for those of you who are hearing about the theory of resistance narratives for the first time, know that we also experienced that sense of wonder when we discovering this field of study, which explores resistance in literature and other visual narratives.
So, for start our conversation, can you tell us how was your first contact with resistance literature, and had you worked with resistance theory before your master's?
I have always worked with gender diversity, especially with a focus on trans identities as a form of resistance. But in my early research, I didn't focus on resistance theories specifically. When I joined PPLSA, I chose this research line on resistance narratives because it most closely aligned with my work. That's when I began studying resistance literature during my master's and through CRENAC.
By the way, this podcast integrates the research project named CRENAC, an acronym in Portuguese for Configurations of Resistance in Contemporary Anglophone Narratives. Our goal with this podcast is to analyze the literary works from the perspective of resistance. Alfredo Bosse's work is an excellent starting point to discussing this idea of resistance.
Alfredo Bosse connects resistance to literature from its meaning in ethics, where resistance is an act where an individual opposes an external force through willpower and personal values. He further explains that resistance appears in literature either as a theme or as an intrinsic process of writing. He also argues that resistance as a theme is a legacy of what he calls the culture of political resistance, which emerged post-war. Through literary narratives, writers highlighted social inequalities and systems of oppression, whether through poetry or prose, or fictional, documentary, or testimonial narratives. In these cases, resistance is the subject of the writing. On the other hand, resistance as an intrinsic process of writing is when a work is crafted to depict a reality of resistance, exposing oppression through its narrative. These two approaches to resistance in literature are not mutually exclusive, according to Bosse. His insights are fundamental for studying resistance narratives in literature.
On an international level, we can see Barbara Harlow's Resistance Literature, which defines the resistance literature as a battlefield. Resistance literature emerges in a context of war, oppression, colonization, and marginalization. Writing in such contexts become a form of resisting oppression, colonization, and war, such as to live under the state of exception. George Agamben critiques the state of exception as the sovereign use of law to suspend individual rights. According to him, this is not temporary government measure but rather a paradigm, the governing technique. This legitimizes atrocities in dehumanization against socially marginalized individuals, as seen in Nazi Germany under Hitler.
Indeed, this context gave rise to relevant works for resistance literature studies, recovering testimonies and narratives from concentration camp survivors. We can also relate this to more recent states of exception, such as dictatorial regimes. Brazil experienced this from 1964 to 1985, but it's a reality shared by other Latin American and global nations. We must also mention the colonization process in African and American countries, which enslaved black and indigenous peoples, creating profound social inequalities.
Sure, and the social inequalities have remained to this day. How is it for you, as an indigenous woman, to work with resistance literature? You live resistance daily.
Yes, simply existing in this territory colonized by Europeans is an act of resistance. For women like me, indigenous and transgender, pursuing graduate studies is a recent movement, a step towards occupying this space of scientific production. So, we are bringing the colonial and counter-colonial perspective to resistance literature studies that allows us to tell our side of the story in our voices, echoing the voices of our ancestors who resisted before us. In this way, we aim to inspire society to view our history with a humanized perspective.
There is the ethical perspective discussed by Alfredo Bossi. This happens when opposite individuals confront the reality, and the voices are heard.
And this is exactly this movement of trans and indigenous people who have historically been marginalized and excluded from spaces such as universities, occupying this space and saying, we exist, we are here, and now we're going to say what has happened to us. I think a fitting way to conclude this first episode would be to ask, what must a work contain to be considered a resistance narrative? How would you answer that, Gustavo?
To qualify a resistance narrative, a work should include elements such as being a set in a context of oppression or injustice, featuring marginalized voices, portraying conflicts and transformations, critiquing power structures, fostering identity employment, and covering hope and resilience. These are the key aspects of resistance narrative works.
I totally agree. These elements are present not only in literature works addressing historical events like post-war, Nazism, dictatorships, or colonization, but also in fictional genres like dystopia and magical realism. These themes extend to audiovisual formats too, such as films, series, documentaries, animations, and even in fictional or fantastical settings, such works remain tied to specific social and historical contexts, with their creators drawing from these realities to craft their narratives. And this connection enables us to relate such works to contexts of resistance.
These demonstrate how art fosters the production of resistance narrative. Many authors highlight art's role in covering and transmitting marginalized memories, testimonies, and experiences, bringing them to the forefront. Our podcast aims to discuss resistance in Brazil and Amazon, where colonial projects oppressed and silenced many peoples and erased their narratives.
In this sense, in our podcast, we will analyze Anglophone literature through the lens of resistance literature, drawing connections with other works by Brazilian authors. We will show that this process of violence, oppression, and resistance have taken place on a global level, and that making these narratives visible and discussing them is also important for denouncing and combating this violence, which is linked to education for ethics. So that's it for our first episode. We thank you for listening to us this far.
We'd also like to thank the American Embassy supporting this project to commemorate the 200 years diplomatic relations between Brazil and the United States. Don't miss the next episode of our podcast. If you enjoyed it, share it with your friends and colleagues interested in resistance literature.